Do those who are calling for a ceasefire mean to also include the hostages and their safe return, women, children and all? And if they do, why do they never mention them? I'm asking for 240 friends.
Francesca.
Would you like me to comment on the hostages?
I mean, he raises the question of the 240 hostages that are not often in all of the demands or chants. Should they be?
It depends on whose demands you are referring to, because at the international level, for example, I mean, from the United Nations system, the demand has been there since the very beginning. Both the Secretary General, all UN agencies, UN special rapporteurs have condemned the crimes committed by Hamas on the 7th of October against Israeli civilians, and killing civilians and taking civilian hostage is a war crime. And I've always, I mean, every time I point to the brutality of what's happening in Gaza, to the inferno that Gaza has been turned into, I always refer to the Palestinians and to the hostages who are there, because both of them are trapped in an inescapable situation. So
can there be a ceasefire without the return of all of the hostages?
There should be a ceasefire.
But can you have a ceasefire without the return of all the hostages is the question.
I think that the two questions go together, but in order, there should be a ceasefire because the situation is beyond catastrophe.
But that's where there's an issue, isn't there? Because for the Israeli community, they say, we want our hostages back before a ceasefire should be countenanced.
Well, there have been, as far as I understand, and you know we are in a very volatile situation, and not every piece of information can be verified. So I rely on what comes from the United Nations on the ground, and there have been several communications that apparently come from the de facto authority, Hamas in Gaza, who has referred to the release of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. And there is, I mean, this is where I agree with you, not listening to each other make us weaker. There is no question that the hostages must return safe and sound to their homes, especially, you know, what has I think, what has been incredible for many of us working with Israeli human rights organizations is that the portion of the population that has been affected the most are people who have been also fighting against apartheid, recognizing the importance of coexistence, and I mean this is critical. It's a tragic moment.
Yeah, all civilians deserve safety. I suppose the question is to you, Mark. If all of the hostages are released, should Israel agree to a ceasefire?
Well, ultimately, I think it's a question of all the hostages being released and also Hamas infrastructure being dismantled, because otherwise we're going to have another little Holocaust like we had on October the 7th. It's going to be repeated again and again and again. I mean, Hamas are quite honest about this. Hamas have said quite explicitly, we are going to repeat this again and again until Israel's destroyed. So it seems to me, really, the first step needs to be to dismantle Hamas. And
so the release of the hostages isn't enough?
No, I don't think it's enough, because otherwise it'll start all over again. Look, you know, I agree with what our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said. She published a piece in The Guardian and she made the point that in order to get peace and in order to have a two-state solution, you've got to dismantle Hamas. You will never, ever... I'm a great believer in a two-state solution, by the way, for a whole lot of reasons that we can go into at the appropriate time. But at the same time, I believe it's impossible. The best way to promote a two-state solution is to get rid of a terrorist entity that is running the Gaza Strip.
I want to go to Tim on that in a moment, but just on Penny Wong, you say you agree with what Penny Wong said. Yeah. She's been criticised over the last day for saying a statement around taking steps towards a ceasefire. Do you support the way she framed that?
I think it's been clarified recently by both her and the Prime Minister that they're not resiling from the fact that they're not calling a ceasefire at this point. in time, because that would be like handing Hamas a gift.
Tim Watts, would you like to see a ceasefire, or has Penny Wong begun the steps towards calling for one?
Well, PK, there are very difficult issues that all governments around the world need to weigh up here, and that's why we've set out a principled approach. We've said that the humanitarian situation in Gaza at the moment is just so unbearably dire that we need immediate action to address that humanitarian situation. That's why we've been calling for humanitarian pauses, so that we can get sustained, unimpeded, safe humanitarian access to Gaza.
Yeah, but if I can take you to my question, is Penny Wong taking us towards a call for a ceasefire? Is this the step before?
Well, what I'm saying is that the call for a humanitarian pause is a necessary first step, but clearly much more needs to be done. That's why we've been talking about, everyone wants to see us taking those next steps towards a ceasefire. But she's made it clear that that is not a one-sided process. That requires two sides to engage in that process. And
is the release of all of the...
yes, the release of
all of the hostages, would that be the preconditions for a ceasefire?
What we have said is that there needs to be the release of the hostages. Hamas needs to stop its rocket attacks on Israel. It needs to stop using civilians in Gaza as human shields. And for a durable peace in the region, we need to dismantle Hamas. We can't have a durable peace with Palestinians and Israelis coexisting in prosperity, in security, side by side, in internationally agreed borders, without dismantling Hamas.
Nasser, at all of these demonstrations, and you've been part of them, big demonstrations, the one in Melbourne over the weekend was very large. The call is for a ceasefire, but there's not a call very often for all of the hostages to be released. Is that a demand that you think needs to be met before that can be considered?
Patricia, I think we need to go back to the reality that this is not a 35-day-old conflict. Everything we're talking about here is frames as October 7 as the start. The reality, Patricia, is I'm an accidental Australian. My father was ethnically cleansed by Jewish terror gangs in the late 40s. Israel hadn't even begun to exist yet. 1948, he was ethnically cleansed before that.
So you're talking about the Nakba,
the Palestinian
as it's referred to, but what I'm asking you about is this chapter of this
Patricia,
particular conflict.
Framing is so important because that's 60 years before Hamas. Israel, as a settler colony, has a problem with the indigenous people. Israel's got a Palestinian problem, not a Hamas problem. If Hamas was wiped out tomorrow, if the hostages went back, nothing's going to change. The settlers are happening. Imagine a world without Hamas. That's the West Bank. We've got the PA, full security control. The Israeli authorities call up the PA, the Palestinian police leave. They go in. On Saturday, 5 boys under 14 were shot and killed.
We're going to get to all of those issues, Nasser, but respectfully, I've asked the panellists to answer the question, so I'm going to ask you as well. The question was in relation to the release of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. Is that something you think should happen?
So we're right here. The hostages should be released, as should Palestinian
Can you understand why Israel would be reluctant for a ceasefire if their hostages are still being held in tunnels?
Well, what I want to look at is the amount of blood that's in the streets. Palestinian corpses are being eaten by dogs. If we can't say 5,000 Palestinian children have died in 35 days and say, first of all, let's stop killing kids. Let's stop killing. That can't be too big an ask of humanity. For 35 days, there's been no food, no water, no gas, no electricity, no medicine.
But should there be the release of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire?
Palestinian children matter too.
But that's not the question I asked, Nasser. I asked, should there be
I want the hostages
release...
to be released. I'm not a Hamas spokesman. I'm an Australian citizen.
No, but some people have accused you of being sympathetic to Hamas. Are you?
I'm not sympathetic to Hamas, but I'm certainly not sympathetic to the state of Israel and what's going on today in Palestine.
Do you think Hamas is a terror organisation?
I'm an Australian citizen. My government has prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organisation. It's not up to me as an Australian citizen to have be a spokesman for the Palestinians or for Palestinian armed groups. The reality is we are living a misery, an apocalypse. UN experts, not Francesca, but others, are starting to talk about this being a genocide. 1 in 100 people by the end of this will have died in Gaza. 1% of the population, that's 260,000 people.
They are warning about a potential genocide. In fact, I've interviewed you about this.
Yes.
In the Hamas Manifesto, a genocide is called for of Israelis, of Jewish people, right?
When I hear Hamas leaders speaking and I hear Israeli military and political leaders speaking these days, I do not hear much difference. The level of dehumanization of the other, because there is a genocidal call that, I mean, Palestinians have been dehumanized through and through. They have been called animals, it was said that it's on record, it was said that no civilians are in Gaza, they are all part of the problem because they could have toppled Hamas, and again, this is totally decontextualized because the Palestinians in Gaza during the Arab Spring and after have tried to topple Hamas. So let me add two elements here.
Briefly, I just want to get to Dave.
First of all, until a couple of months ago, various members of the Israeli cabinet have been on record saying that Hamas was an asset and the Palestinian Authority was a liability. And even Ehud Barak, I was on a panel where he was invited, and he was saying this has been a feature of subsequent Netanyahu's cabinet. But one aside of it, the point is that you ask questions about the ceasefire in exchange of hostages. No, I mean, the two go together from a humane point of view. But from a legal point of view, we are outside what is permitted under international law because Israel, the response that Israel has given is in terms of self-defense under international law, the UN Charter, that, sorry, doesn't apply here.
Okay. Dave Sharma.
Well, absolutely, the hostages should be released. I mean, bear in mind there's, I think, 239 still being held, only 4 have been released. There are multiple nationalities. I mean, there's 25 Thai agricultural workers, amongst others, that are being held. Taking of hostages is a clear war crime, as was Hamas's attacks on Israel of the 7th of October. So I think the releasing of the hostages is necessary, but it's also not sufficient. I think the only way we get to a more hopeful future for both Israelis and Palestinians and towards a two-state solution, which I also support, is if Hamas is ousted from political power and no longer has the ability to threaten Israel. I mean, we had a spokesperson from Hamas's political bureau, Ghazi Hamid, speaking on Lebanese TV just a few weeks ago, 24th of October, saying there will be a second 7th of October attack and a third and a fourth until Israel is exterminated or Israel is annihilated. It is impossible for either Gazan Palestinians or Israelis to live in peace whilst Hamas remains in political power in Gaza.
Now I'd like to go to a question from Eamon.